In a small American town, one woman's humble farm fed the hungry, a beacon of hope for those in need. But when the state moved to take everything from her, her home, her garden, her lifeline, it seemed all was lost, until the community she had nurtured came together, risking everything, standing hand in hand to protect what they loved. This is the story of courage, compassion, and a fight that no machine could win. The engines came like a sentence. Heavy, inevitable, and wrong. For a town that still measured its days by church bells and corn silage, the sound felt like a foreign invasion, the sort that arrives in gray vans and hard hats and leaves a contour of ash on the map where something gentle once lived. Eleanor Whitmore woke before dawn because she always did. Habit was a kind of prayer for her. A slow, exacting rhythm of watering cans, a checking of trellises, a whisper to the soil as if it might answer. The garden had been her late husband's refuge and then her refuge. It had been where she learned the names of sun and patience and how to coax tomatoes into a sunburst of red even in a late frost. Over 15 years she had coaxed a community around that small patch of earth. A loose congregation of truth. Veterans who smelled like diesel, teenagers who preferred shelters to silence, single mothers who measured days in rent due and nursery smiles. Her gate bore a hand-painted sign that anyone who'd ever needed a meal could read without shame. If you're hungry, take what you need. That sign was not advertised or fundraised. It was a promise, issued in crooked letters and a certain kind of stubborn generosity. Eleanor never took money for the jars she packed, the soups she ladled into thermoses, nor for the crates of squash she left at the church steps. She took the weather's work and shared it. In a country loud with declared liberty. Then, that sign had quietly become the truest architecture of it. She had been served a letter 3 weeks before the day the machines came. The legalese had its own cruelty, precise as a surgeon's cut. Notice of reclamation. Eminent domain. Words for people who live by deadlines and spreadsheets, not by the slow calculus of seasons and scarred hands. The municipality called the land strategic, and the plan vital for development. They spoke of progress the way a sermon preaches inevitability. A commercial complex, new jobs, a vision. Tidy, bright, perfect for rendering a map that pleased investors. Eleanor read the paper in the kitchen's dawn light with a cup that had once been chipped and mended with glue. She folded the letter with the kind of care usually reserved for letters from loved ones. There was a pounding in her chest like a trapped bird. She walked to the mayor's office the next day wearing a cardigan that had been knit by hand and smelling faintly of basil. They were polite. Politeness is exile with a smile. The clerk repeated, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the decision has been finalized." The mayor extended his hand and called her generous. Generosity, in their mouths, sounded almost quaint. The week before demolition moved like a wound opening. Some neighbors said nothing because there are debts heavier than rhetoric. Others bent their heads and crossed the street because solidarity has a cost many believe they cannot afford. But the faces who mattered to Eleanor, the boy who slept at the church porch, the nurse who'd lost a night to saving strangers and found a day to sow seedlings, the veteran who came for respite and never left, those faces gathered in her memory like necklaces of small, bright things. Eleanor planted anyway. She dug new rows with the stubborn patience that grief had taught her, placed seedlings in soil still learning to host life. She stitched extra jars of pickles and packed more loaves than usual, leaving them on the stoop of the shelter with a note. For winter, for anyone, take. It was no defiance to plant. It was a declaration. On the morning the machines came, fog lay low over the fields like a rumor. The first bulldozer's tread sounded distant, a drumbeat that made birds lift and then fall silent. The machines were gleaming in the low light, their teeth scarred and hungry. Men in orange vests moved with a practiced choreography. Ropes, cones, cameras for the safety brief. A man in a navy suit with a clipboard approached Eleanor's garden, as if he were entering a theater in which his lines had been rehearsed. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he said, the tone balanced between apology and assurance. "We have authorization to begin. For your safety, we need you to leave the property immediately." Eleanor looked at him as if he had mistaken the earth for an asset to be leveled and not the repository of people's small mercies. "Please," she said, "just let me harvest the tomatoes. The shelter waits. The food won't keep for the schedule you have." He consulted a watch as if to measure the charity he could afford and replied, "I'm sorry, ma'am. The schedule is tight." The machines coughed awake. The air tasted of diesel and the kind of official time that erodes things that do not produce quarterly returns. But a sound moved across the lawn that was not machinery. Footsteps, light at first, then gathering weight. A boy in a red hoodie emerged from the tree-line carrying a paper bag. He offered Eleanor a wrapped sandwich and 3 crumpled dollars, his lunch money and more. He did not speak, only set the bag at her feet and kissed the top of his mother's hand as if she had done the right thing. One person became 3, then 10, then dozens. A nurse in scrubs unbuttoned her sleeve and took off her badge. A man in boots set down his work gloves. A teenager with a guitar case leaned against the fence and did not play, but hummed a tune that people recognized. They formed a ring around the garden like a soft wall. Hands joined, shoulders pressed, the ordinary geometry of people refusing to be moved. Cameras found the scene. Someone uploaded a shaky clip that widened like a fracture across morning feeds. Hashtag Save Eleanor's Garden trended first in the county, then the state. Reporters arrived with the punctual grimness of those who smell a story. A drone circled, translating the human ring into an aerial graphic the networks could sell. The mayor's office called for a statement but could not fashion one that would not sound flippant or cruel. The contractor argued, "We have permits. The law is clear." A woman yelled from the crowd, "Legality isn't morality." The word hung there, a bell tolling for things you cannot buy back once the shovel has turned. People brought blankets and thermoses of coffee and sat on the grass as if they were at church. They began to tell one another the names of those who had been fed from Eleanor's garden and the reasons why. Because of a lost job, because of a hospital bill, because of a night in a car where the heater had failed. Each story knitted the crowd tighter. Eleanor did not grandstand. She moved with the economy of someone used to conserving energy for what mattered. Reporters asked for sound bites, and she offered instead small sentences that landed like stones in a pond. "I plant what I can. I share what grows. The rest is up to the world." As the afternoon slipped, the mayor arrived with a prepared statement that he read with the clinical fortitude of someone delivering bad news to a distant relative. His words about progress and opportunity washed against the human ring and found no purchase. A child called out, "Will you eat our land?" And the simplicity of the question found its mark in the public feed. People on the perimeter began to cry. Some laughed, a small, sharp sound like release. When dusk came, lanterns appeared. Strings of small bulbs and battery candles. The kind people break out for vigils. Someone strung a line of fairy lights along Eleanor's fence, and it gave the field a church-like glow. Around the garden, people shared stories in low voices, and a line of volunteers organized a rota to ensure someone stayed overnight. Donations started to appear online, anonymous and small at first. $100 here, a pair of gloves there. But momentum is contagious. By midnight, the field had become a living headline. Anchors and city studios couched it as a small-town standoff. But the scene had the tenderness of a community refusing to lose its moral center. The machines waited in the dark, their silhouettes monstrous against the stars. Eleanor sat on an overturned crate with her hands folded and her cardigan pulled tight. Someone offered her a thermos. She took it and stayed. And in the silence between engines, the town discovered its own courage. The morning after the standoff dawned pale and fragile. Mist clung to the soil, and the smell of diesel had not yet left the air. The bulldozers stood idle, their engines off but their presence heavy, like predators watching from a distance. News vans lined the country road that led to Eleanor's gate, their antennas stabbing at the sky. Reporters sipped coffee from paper cups and murmured about how the story had gone national overnight. But for Eleanor, the world still revolved around simple rituals. Watering, pruning, touching the soil to remember what mattered. She moved slowly through the garden rows, her boots sinking into the damp ground. Every leaf seemed to carry a memory. There was the row of beans that she'd planted with little Lily, the girl whose father had vanished one winter and never returned. There were the sunflowers that an old man named Darnell had tended after coming back from the VA hospital, his hands still shaking from the ghosts of war. Each seed had a story. Each root had a name. To strangers, it was just a garden. To Eleanor, it was the book of her life, written in earth instead of ink. While the world debated the legality of her defiance, the townspeople began to remember. Memory has its own rebellion, quiet but stubborn. They remembered the nights she had left baskets on porches, the winters when she gave away blankets and jars of soup. They remembered her laughter echoing through the church hall when she organized the first harvest feast. And they remembered how she never asked for recognition, only that they pay it forward. That morning, something began to bloom beyond the soil. Resolve. The mayor called a meeting at City Hall. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. Business owners argued about the project delay. The construction company warned of lost revenue. The mayor drummed his fingers on the desk. "We cannot appear weak," he said. "If we let sentiment dictate progress, we'll set a dangerous precedent." Someone suggested offering Eleanor compensation, a check large enough to quiet the outrage. But even the proposal felt hollow. You cannot buy back a soul, and everyone in that room knew it. Outside, the people gathered again. They brought banners painted overnight. "Hands off her garden. Food is not for sale. The heart of Willow Creek beats here." Children stood on their parents' shoulders, waving paper flowers. The sheriff, who had grown up eating Eleanor's cornbread, kept his deputies at a distance. "Let them be," he said. "Ain't breaking any laws by standing together." By noon, television cameras from across the state had arrived. Reporters asked Eleanor how she felt being at the center of a national storm. She smiled softly and said, "I didn't start anything. I just planted some seeds. The rest is everyone waking up." Her words were quiet, but they rippled through the crowd like wind across tall grass. As the day wore on, strangers began arriving from other towns. A baker drove 3 hours to deliver bread to the protesters. A group of students came with sleeping bags and signs. A retired journalist brought an old Polaroid camera and started taking portraits of everyone there, pinning them on a board by the gate. Each photograph was another route, another proof of connection. At sunset, the mayor returned to the site under pressure from the governor's office. Reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. He spoke into microphones with the cautious tone of a man trying to reclaim control of a story that had outgrown him. "We recognize the deep emotional value of this land," he began. "But progress cannot be halted by sentiment." The crowd responded with silence. Not shouting, not jeering, just the heavy silence of disapproval. That silence, caught live on national television, said everything words could not. That night, Eleanor sat by the porch with a lantern beside her. The stars stretched wide above the fields, the way her husband used to say they only did for honest souls. The nurse, the veteran, the boy in the red hoodie, they all sat nearby. People shared bread and stories. Someone played a harmonica softly, a tune that drifted across the dark like a promise. The television crews filmed, but for once it didn't feel like intrusion. Felt like witness. Meanwhile, far beyond Willow Creek, viewers across the country argued and cried and donated. A crowdfunding campaign began online, its goal modest, to help Eleanor buy back her land. Within hours, it surpassed every expectation. $10,000, then 50, then 100. Companies reached out, offering lawyers, advisors, and free publicity. What had begun as one woman's stand had turned into a movement, a reminder that decency still existed in a world that often forgot it. But inside the small farmhouse, Eleanor didn't check her phone or watch the news. She brewed chamomile tea and spoke to her husband's photograph, as she always did when the world felt too loud. "George," she whispered, "they're all here. Can you believe it? They're standing up for a little patch of dirt. For me. For us." Her voice cracked, but her smile held. In the distance, the machines waited, silent but menacing silhouettes against the moonlight. Their operators slept in motels paid by the hour, uneasy about the work they might have to do. The mayor held emergency calls with state officials, while lawyers debated clauses and headlines speculated outcomes. But down at the garden, something more powerful than law was taking root. Belonging. Near midnight, a local priest arrived with candles. He asked if he could bless the soil. Eleanor nodded. People bowed their heads as he prayed softly, his voice trembling with emotion. Lord, let what was planted in kindness grow in peace. Let no greed uproot what love has made. When he finished, even the reporters lowered their cameras. The next morning, newspapers across America printed her photograph. Eleanor in her blue cardigan, standing with her hands in the soil, a line of people behind her stretching into the fog. The headline read, "One woman's garden stops a town." And beneath it, smaller text, "What does progress mean if it costs our humanity?" Calls flooded the mayor's office. The governor demanded a statement. Late that evening, under immense public pressure, the city issued a temporary suspension of all demolition activities. The garden would stand, at least for now. When Eleanor heard the news, she didn't cheer. She just exhaled, a sound that seemed to lift from her chest into the sky. She knew it wasn't over, but it was enough. Enough to plant hope. She walked out into the field, stars burning bright above her, and knelt in the dirt. The soil was cool under her fingers. She whispered, "We're still here." And in that moment, surrounded by the hum of insects and the faint echo of distant traffic, Eleanor realized something profound. The garden had grown beyond her. It was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had stood beside her, everyone who believed that kindness was worth defending. The night air smelled of rain and redemption. Somewhere in the darkness, a new wind began to stir, carrying with it the promise of what was still to come. For a few days, peace hovered over Willow Creek like the fragile calm after a storm. The garden was safe, at least for now. But peace, Eleanor knew, was never permanent. It had to be tended like the soil itself, nurtured and defended against whatever came next. She woke before dawn each morning, watching the horizon light up behind the old barn. The air carried a faint sweetness, the scent of tomatoes ripening and rain-soaked grass. From the porch, she could hear laughter. The volunteers who had stayed overnight, making breakfast on camp stoves, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs. It felt almost like a festival, except everyone knew the shadow that still loomed beyond the fence line. Across the street, the idle machines sat behind a makeshift barricade, guarded by men in reflective vests. They looked more restless than dangerous, their yellow frames glinting beneath the morning sun. But to Eleanor, they were still monsters, symbols of what could vanish in an instant if the world stopped watching. She had seen it before, how attention shifted like the wind, how outrage cooled once the headlines faded. In town, the story had divided neighbors. The diner was split down the middle, farmers and clerks on one side praising Eleanor's courage, developers and city officials on the other insisting that progress was being strangled by nostalgia. The mayor appeared on television again, this time with carefully rehearsed sincerity. "We all admire Mrs. Whitmore's generosity," he said, "but we must also remember that the needs of many outweigh the wishes of one." His words landed like stones. The anchor nodded gravely, but online the reaction was brutal. People flooded the city's website with comments. "She feeds the hungry. What do you feed, Mayor?" Read one viral post. The donations continued to pour in. A lawyer from Boston offered his services pro bono. A television host announced an upcoming feature segment titled "The Woman Who Grew a Revolution." Packages arrived daily, letters, seeds, hand-knitted scarves, checks folded into envelopes decorated with children's drawings. Eleanor tried to read every note, but by the third day, there were too many. So she placed them in a wooden crate by the porch, whispering thanks each time she added another. Despite the hope swelling around her, exhaustion began to creep in. Each morning, she felt it a little more. The ache in her knees, the fog in her mind. But she refused to rest. "If I stop now," she told herself, "they'll think we've lost the fight." Her friends insisted she take breaks, but Eleanor was stubborn. The garden had become her heartbeat, and she couldn't let it falter. On the fifth day, a letter arrived from the Department of Urban Development. It was cold, sterile, typed in bureaucratic rhythm. It stated that despite public sentiment, the land acquisition remained legally binding. The temporary suspension would expire within 7 days unless an alternative proposal was submitted. Eleanor read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it on the kitchen table. Her hands trembled. She didn't cry. Instead, she stared at the old clock above the sink and whispered, 7 days. That's what they're giving us. That night, she gathered her closest supporters around the porch table. Reverend Cole, Darnell, Lily's mother, and 2 volunteers who had driven from Oregon to help. The lantern light flickered across their faces as she spoke. They're waiting for us to give up. They think we'll run out of steam, that the world will move on. Her voice grew firmer. We won't. The Reverend leaned forward. Then we'll take this higher. To the governor, to Washington if we have to. Word spread quickly. Eleanor had 7 days to save the garden. Hashtags appeared online. Hashtag 7 days for hope. Hashtag stand with Eleanor. Celebrities shared her story. An actress known for her activism sent a video message promising to visit. Donations tripled overnight. But with each passing day, the pressure grew heavier. Media vans crowded the narrow road. Helicopters thumped overhead, and strangers camped on the edges of the property. The peaceful haven began to feel like a siege. By the 3rd day, tempers began to fray. Volunteers argued over logistics. Reporters fought for exclusive interviews. One evening, 2 men claiming to be concerned citizens tried to cut through the fence, shouting that Eleanor was holding the town hostage. The sheriff's deputies escorted them away, but the message was clear. Not everyone believed she was a hero. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her kitchen, the only light coming from the stove. Her reflection wavered in the window. A small woman in a worn cardigan, her face lined by both age and resolve. She thought about her husband again, about the years they had worked this land together, how they dreamed of growing something bigger than themselves. We were never meant to own it, she murmured. We were meant to share it. But now, even sharing had become an act of defiance. On the 6th day, the governor finally called. His voice was calm but cautious. Mrs. Whitmore, I admire what you've built, but the law is the law. Unless your supporters raise the full market value of the land, the city retains ownership. The figure he quoted was staggering. Even with all the donations, they were still far short. Eleanor thanked him politely, though her heart felt like it was sinking into the earth. After she hung up, she walked out to the field, where dozens of volunteers were planting new rows of greens under floodlights. Keep going, she told them. Even if they take it all, we'll leave them something worth growing back. Her words carried across the field like wind through corn stalks. Some people cried openly. Others worked faster. The 7th morning arrived gray and heavy with fog. Reporters gathered at the edge of the field, their breath visible in the chill. The demolition company had received no new orders but stood ready, their engines idling in the distance. Felt like waiting for a verdict. The mayor was nowhere to be seen. The crowd murmured prayers, chants, songs. Eleanor stood in the center of the garden, holding a small spade, her fingers tracing the worn wooden handle. She wasn't afraid anymore, just tired. But beneath that fatigue lived something fierce and unbreakable. Then, just as the clock struck 9, a convoy of cars appeared on the road. At first, no one recognized them. Then came the flash of cameras as people realized who it was. The actress, the talk show host, the lawyer from Boston, and a delegation of local business owners. They stepped out, solemn but smiling. The lawyer handed Eleanor a folder. Inside was a document signed and notarized. The purchase of the land, fully funded by donations from across the nation. The title would be transferred back to her name. The garden was hers again. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then a sob broke from somewhere in the crowd. Then another. Within seconds, cheers erupted, echoing across the valley. The bulldozer operators shut off their engines and leaned out of their cabs, clapping. The sheriff took off his hat and wiped his eyes. Even the reporters forgot to speak, too moved to narrate what they were witnessing. Eleanor's knees gave way, and the Reverend caught her before she fell. "It's over," he whispered. "You did it." She shook her head softly. "No," she said, looking around at the sea of faces, at the soil under her hands. "We did it." The cameras captured the moment. The sun breaking through the fog, casting a golden glow over the field as Eleanor pressed her palm into the dirt one last time. The headlines that followed would call it the miracle of Willow Creek. But for Eleanor, it wasn't a miracle. It was proof that when people stand together, they can root themselves deeper than fear, stronger than greed. That night, as darkness fell and the celebration stretched into song, Eleanor walked alone through the rows of her garden. Fireflies drifted like tiny lanterns. She touched each leaf, each stem, whispering the names of those who had helped. "For you, George," she said softly, gazing up at the stars. "And for everyone who believed." The garden rustled in reply, alive, eternal. Hope, she realized, had weight, but it was the kind of weight you carried gladly. The morning after the victory, the sky over Willow Creek glowed with a light so gentle it seemed to bless the earth itself. The machines were gone. The barricades were taken down. Only footprints remained, hundreds of them pressed into the soft soil, evidence of how many had stood there together. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor's land was quiet. Not empty, but peaceful. The kind of peace that comes after a long, hard fight. A peace earned, not given. She stood on the porch with a mug of tea, steam curling into the dawn. Her old cardigan hung loosely from her shoulders. In the distance, the first rays of sunlight touched the rows of beans and kale, turning dew into a shimmer of silver. The garden looked almost sacred, like a chapel of earth and breath. It was strange, she thought, how something so small, a handful of acres, had captured the heart of a nation. But that's what happens when people remember that goodness can still take root. News crews returned that morning, this time not for conflict but for celebration. Reporters moved carefully through the garden, whispering as if afraid to disturb something holy. One asked Eleanor how it felt to be a symbol of hope. She smiled faintly and said, "Hope doesn't belong to me. It belongs to everyone who showed up." Her humility only deepened the world's affection. Within hours, clips of her speaking spread across every network and social feed. Comments poured in by the thousands. "She reminds me of my grandmother. This is what America should be. Protect her at all costs." The following week, trucks arrived, not with bulldozers, but with lumber, soil, and seedlings. Volunteers from across the country had come to help rebuild. They called it the Community Expansion Project. The plan was simple yet profound. Turn the small garden into a self-sustaining farm capable of feeding hundreds. Companies donated irrigation systems and solar panels. Architects drew up blueprints for a small education center and greenhouse. A local college offered scholarships for students who wanted to study sustainable agriculture. The garden, once threatened with erasure, was becoming a beacon. Eleanor watched it all unfold with disbelief and quiet joy. There were moments she had to step away, sit beneath the old oak, and just breathe. The pace of it all felt unreal. Journalists camped nearby, influencers filmed videos among the corn stalks, and politicians, those same faces who had once ignored her letters, now stood at her gate for photo ops. She tolerated them politely, but her patience was reserved for those who came to work, not to be seen. One afternoon, a little girl approached her. A small thing with tangled hair and a sunflower painted on her cheek. She held out a folded piece of paper. "My mom said you saved people," the girl said shyly. Eleanor crouched, took the paper, and opened it. Inside was a drawing of a woman with angel wings watering plants. Above it, in shaky crayon letters, "Thank you for feeding us." Eleanor couldn't speak. She hugged the child instead, tears slipping down her cheeks like morning dew. By midsummer, the expansion was nearly complete. A large wooden sign now stood at the entrance. "The Whitmore Foundation, where hope grows." It wasn't Eleanor's idea. The volunteers had insisted on naming it after her, though she argued it should be for everyone. "You planted the first seed," they said. "You showed us what roots can do." Beneath the name was a simple inscription. for those who hunger in body or in spirit. The first harvest festival drew crowds from across the state. Music filled the air, fiddles, guitars, laughter. Long tables stretched across the field, laden with vegetables, bread, and pies. Strangers shared meals as if they'd known each other their whole lives. The local news called it a new American tradition born from the soil of defiance. For Eleanor, it was something even simpler. The sound of community breathing again. As night fell, strings of lights flickered on between the trees. Children danced barefoot in the dirt while adults clapped along. At the edge of it all, Eleanor sat in her rocking chair, a cup of cider in hand. The stars were out bright, alive. Reverend Cole came to stand beside her. "You realize this place has become more than a garden," he said. She nodded slowly. "It's a reminder." He smiled. "A reminder of what?" Eleanor looked out at the glowing field. "That kindness doesn't die easy." A week later, she received a letter from Washington, an invitation to speak at a national conference on community sustainability. First, she laughed. "What do I know about conferences?" she said to Darnell. But he encouraged her to go. They need to hear from someone who's done it with their hands, not from behind a desk. Reluctantly, she agreed. In September, Eleanor boarded a plane for the first time in her life. Reporters waited at the airport, snapping photos of her simple denim dress and worn hat. When she reached the stage, standing before hundreds of policymakers and academics, she spoke without notes. "I'm not here to talk about laws or budgets," she began. "I'm here to talk about people. People who were hungry, people who were kind, people who stood between machines and a garden because they remembered what mattered." Her voice trembled, but her words carried. The audience rose to their feet before she finished. Her speech made headlines again. Donations surged, partnerships formed, and within months, similar community gardens began sprouting in cities and small towns across the nation. Each one carried a piece of her legacy. Patches of green defying concrete, reminders that compassion could still grow in unlikely places. Journalists called it the Whitmore effect. Sociologists wrote essays about it. But Eleanor just called it the work. Back in Willow Creek, life settled into a new rhythm. The garden had become an organization, yes, but it was still a home. Volunteers came and went, bringing stories from other states. Gardens inspired by hers in Detroit, Phoenix, and even Los Angeles. She listened to each with quiet pride. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low and the fields glowed amber, she would imagine George walking beside her, his boots kicking up the dust. "You did good, Ellie," she could almost hear him say. "You did real good." But fame, like any harvest, has its thorns. As the foundation grew, so did the scrutiny. Some critics claimed the movement was being politicized. Others accused her of turning charity into spectacle. Talk shows debated whether kindness could survive in the spotlight. Through it all, Eleanor stayed silent. She didn't care for the noise. The work spoke louder than any opinion ever could. Then came the letter that would change everything again. It was from a man named Thomas Avery, CEO of a major agricultural corporation. He proposed a partnership, large-scale funding to expand the foundation nationwide. His letter was eloquent, persuasive, full of promises about eradicating hunger through innovation. But at the bottom, in fine print, it also stated that ownership of the land and branding rights would shift to his company. It was progress disguised as generosity. Eleanor read it twice, her heart sinking. She had seen this kind of deal before, the kind that looked like help but felt like chains. That night, she gathered her team in the small wooden office by the greenhouse. The air was thick with tension. Some argued that accepting the deal would save thousands of lives. Others warned it would destroy everything the garden stood for. Eleanor listened quietly, letting them speak. When the room fell silent, she stood. "We started this to feed people," she said, "not to feed profit. If we sign that paper, we'll be no better than the ones who tried to bulldoze us." Her words carried the same weight they had that first night the machines arrived. No one argued after that. The next morning, she penned her reply by hand. "Dear Mr. Avery," she wrote, "thank you for your generous offer. But the garden was never for sale. Not then, not now, not ever. If you wish to help, plant something. Water it. Feed someone with it. That's how you can join us. She sealed the letter with a firm press of her thumb and smiled. Some victories she knew were quiet ones. Autumn came, painting the fields gold and crimson. The air smelled of apples and smoke. The harvest this year was bountiful, record-breaking, the papers said. But for Eleanor, it wasn't about numbers. It was about the faces she saw every day. The mother holding a box of fresh vegetables with tears in her eyes. The teenager volunteering after school. The veteran teaching kids how to plant tomatoes. Every smile was proof that kindness, once planted, could outlive even the hardest winters. One evening, as the sun sank low, Eleanor stood by the fence line, watching the horizon fade into orange and purple. The sound of laughter carried from the garden, and for the first time in months, she felt completely still. The fight was over, but the work would never end, and that, she thought, was exactly how it should be. She touched the soil, still warm from the day, and whispered, "Grow well." Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed across the valley, long and low, a reminder that the world kept moving. But here, in Willow Creek, something had taken root that would not be moved again. The seeds had been sown not just in soil but in hearts. And as long as there were hands willing to nurture them, the harvest of hope would never end. Winter crept into Willow Creek quietly that year, as though afraid to disturb what the garden had become. Frost glazed the windows of the farmhouse, and the fields that once shimmered with green now slept beneath a soft blanket of white. But even in stillness, life persisted. Beneath the soil, seeds waited patiently, storing strength for the spring. Inside the farmhouse, Eleanor Whitmore did the same. She had grown slower, her steps measured, her hair now a crown of silver. But her eyes still carried that same steady flame, the one that had faced down bulldozers and bureaucracy, greed and exhaustion. Some called her a hero, others a saint. Eleanor didn't like either word. "I'm just a gardener," she'd say with a laugh that ended in a cough. But everyone in Willow Creek knew better. The world had changed because of her hands. The Whitmore Foundation had expanded far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Dozens of gardens now thrived in every corner of the country, each one inspired by that first stand of defiance. They shared seeds, stories, and volunteers, bound by a simple creed Eleanor had written on the foundation's wall. "We grow not for ourselves, but for one another." Her words became a pledge recited by schoolchildren, a motto engraved on garden gates from Oregon to Maine. Despite the fame, Eleanor remained where it all began, in her little farmhouse overlooking the field. She refused every offer to move to a bigger home or take an office in the city. "If I can't smell the soil," she said, "I can't think straight." Her staff understood. They came to her for advice, guidance, and sometimes just quiet company. The world around her had become faster, louder, more digital, but Eleanor stayed rooted in simplicity. She still kept handwritten ledgers, still sent letters by post, still brewed tea every morning before dawn. Each winter, volunteers took shifts tending the greenhouse, ensuring that the garden never slept entirely. Warm lights glowed through frosted glass at night, making it look like a beacon in the darkness. Local families would visit just to see it, drawn by the comfort it radiated. "It's the heart of Willow Creek," people said, and in truth it was. When the wind howled through the valley, it was that light that reminded everyone spring would return. But age, like winter, spares no one. Eleanor's body grew frail, her hands stiff from years of toil. She began to spend more time in the rocking chair by the window, wrapped in quilts, a notebook on her lap. She wrote letters to friends, to volunteers, to children she had once fed. Sometimes she spoke them aloud, as if George were still listening beside her. "We did good, didn't we?" she'd whisper. "We gave them something to believe in." The clock would tick, the fire would crackle, and the garden outside would sleep on, waiting for her voice again. One evening, a blizzard swept across the valley, the worst in years. Power lines snapped, roads vanished beneath drifts of snow. But at the farmhouse, lanterns glowed. Volunteers had gathered, refusing to leave her alone. They cooked soup on a wood stove, told stories of the early days, laughed until their sides ached. When they asked Eleanor to rest, she only smiled. "The storm can do what it wants," she said softly. "We've weathered worse." That night, while the wind howled outside, she asked Darnell to bring her the small tin box from the mantel. Inside were seeds, carefully labeled, saved from the very first planting. She held them in her palm, their weight almost nothing, yet infinite. "Promise me," she said, her voice trembling. "When spring comes, you'll plant these again, right here in this soil." Darnell nodded, tears shining in his eyes. "We will, Eleanor. I swear it." She smiled faintly, closing her fingers over the seeds. Then it settled. Nothing ends as long as something grows. Days later, when the storm cleared, the valley emerged glittering and silent. The farmhouse stood untouched, smoke rising gently from the chimney. But inside, Eleanor Whitmore had passed quietly in her sleep, her notebook still open on her lap. The last line she had written was simple: "Keep the garden alive." News of her passing rippled across the nation like a wave. Candlelight vigils were held in cities and towns. Newspapers printed her portrait on their front pages. Eleanor in her blue cardigan, smiling beside the garden gate. The headline read, "The Keeper of Hope has gone home." The president gave a brief address, calling her a reminder that the roots of compassion run deeper than any policy. The words were sincere, but the real tribute came from the people, those she had fed, those she had inspired, those who had stood with her in the mud and rain. A week later, thousands traveled to Willow Creek for her memorial. The garden, still dusted with snow, became a sea of color as mourners placed flowers, letters, and small packets of seeds by the fence. The air buzzed with quiet reverence. No one spoke loudly. Even the children seemed to understand that this was sacred ground. Reverend Cole led the service beneath the oak tree. His voice carried gently over the crowd. "Eleanor taught us that a seed is more than a beginning. It's a promise. And promises, like love, don't die. They grow." He looked out across the field. "She gave us this place, but more than that, she gave us the courage to care. Now it's our turn to keep it growing." After the ceremony, as dusk settled, Darnell gathered a small group by the greenhouse. He held up the tin box she had given him. "She wanted these planted today," he said. One by one, people knelt in the snow and pressed the seeds into the earth. The soil was cold, but their hands were warm. When they were done, they stood in silence, their breath rising in soft clouds. Somewhere above them, the first star appeared. Spring came late that year. For weeks, the ground remained hard, the nights long. But one morning, a child shouted from the edge of the field, "They're growing!" And there they were, tiny green shoots pushing through the thawing soil. Within days, the whole garden began to stir, color returning to every row. It was as if the land itself had been waiting for her blessing. People from all over came to see, leaving tokens and prayers. Someone carved a wooden sign that read, "Eleanor's Field, forever in bloom." As months passed, the foundation continued its work with renewed purpose. They established the Eleanor Whitmore Fellowship, supporting young leaders who wanted to build community gardens around the world. The first recipient, a woman from Detroit, visited Willow Creek to thank the volunteers in person. "I was homeless once," she told them, tears in her eyes. "Then I heard her story. Now I run 3 gardens that feed hundreds." Her roots reached me. Stories like hers spread everywhere. In New Orleans, a flood-ravaged neighborhood built a new community farm named after Eleanor. In rural Alaska, children grew vegetables in greenhouses using techniques shared by the Whitmore Foundation. Even overseas, her influence bloomed. Fields in Kenya, rooftops in Brazil, alleyways in Tokyo. Everywhere, the same small act repeated. Someone bent down, pressed a seed into soil, and whispered a silent thank you to a woman they had never met. In Willow Creek, life carried on. Darnell became the new caretaker, though he never claimed the title of director. "She's still the one running this place," he'd say with a chuckle, looking toward the sky. On quiet nights, he swore he could hear her rocking chair creak on the porch, the faint rustle of her voice among the leaves. Years passed, and the world changed again, new challenges, new crises. But through them all, the gardens endured. Children who had once played in the dirt became teachers, farmers, dreamers. And each spring, on the anniversary of her passing, people returned to Willow Creek. They came with candles, music, and seeds. They planted in silence first, then sang. The melody was simple, the same tune once hummed by Eleanor as she worked. Low, steady, full of life. One particularly warm evening, decades later, a young boy wandered through the rows of vegetables, his mother telling him stories about the woman who had started it all. "Did she really stop the machines?" he asked, wide-eyed. His mother smiled. "She didn't stop them, sweetheart. She made them stop themselves." The boy looked thoughtful, kneeling to touch the soil. "Will she come back?" "In a way," his mother said, pointing to the plants swaying gently in the breeze. "She never left." That night, as the sun set over Willow Creek, the fields shimmered under the golden light. The air smelled of basil and rain, and the laughter of children echoed across the valley. The farmhouse still stood, its porch light glowing like a star. And though Eleanor Whitmore was long gone, her spirit lingered, woven into the soil, the roots, the hearts of all who came after. The garden would never die, because it had become something far greater than a patch of earth. It had become a living memory, a promise kept. Years had passed since Eleanor Whitmore's quiet departure. The world had moved at its relentless pace, but Willow Creek remained a sanctuary, a patch of earth that refused to yield to time, greed, or forgetfulness. The garden had grown beyond imagination. What was once a small plot of vegetables had become a sprawling expanse of community farms, greenhouses, and educational centers. Children ran freely through the rows, learning the names of plants and the rhythms of seasons, guided by volunteers who had once been strangers and were now family. The air carried a mixture of scents: basil, fresh earth, baked bread, and it felt like breathing hope itself. Each spring, the Whitmore Foundation hosted the Festival of Roots, a week-long celebration of growth, generosity, and resilience. Volunteers from across the nation converged on Willow Creek, bringing with them new ideas, tools, and boundless energy. They built vertical gardens, fish ponds, and small classrooms for teaching sustainability. People brought instruments, painted murals, and shared stories of how Eleanor's example had transformed their communities. Some had started gardens in urban backyards, others had turned empty lots into thriving food hubs. The festival was not about Eleanor anymore. It was about the values she had planted, now flourishing far beyond her own vision. Despite the scale, the essence remained personal. Each seed carried a memory. Darnell, now in his late 60s, kept a small notebook, recording the names of every child who planted a seed each spring, every volunteer who had stayed the night, every donor whose contribution had nourished growth. He would occasionally sit by the greenhouse, closing his eyes, imagining Eleanor's voice humming softly above the wind. "Keep them rooted," she seemed to say, and so they did. One particularly radiant morning, a group of school children gathered at the garden entrance, holding tiny ceramic pots in their hands. A young girl, no older than 7, looked up at Darnell. "Are you sure she won't come back?" she asked, wide-eyed. Darnell knelt beside her. "In a way," he said gently, "she never left. Every plant you touch, every meal you share, every person you help, that's her spirit working through you." The children nodded solemnly, understanding something older than words. The garden had become a living archive. Rows were planted in honor of people Eleanor had helped: the homeless, the sick, the lonely. Each section had a plaque or a small handwritten note, a tangible record of lives touched by simple acts of kindness. Every visitor, whether a local resident or someone from across the ocean, could walk through and feel the pulse of generosity that Eleanor had sparked. It was a rhythm that transcended time, one that would continue as long as the soil could bear life. Meanwhile, the Whitmore Foundation had evolved into a global network. They partnered with international aid organizations to combat food insecurity in cities and villages alike. Agricultural scientists, volunteers, and educators collaborated to create sustainable solutions, always grounding their work in Eleanor's philosophy. People before profit, nurture before destruction. Even in regions ravaged by drought or political unrest, small gardens flourished, and with them, communities rediscovered the power of unity and care. Eleanor's story became a legend, told in classrooms, recounted in newspapers, dramatized in documentaries. She was described as a woman who had defied machines, governments, and indifference, who had shown that one life, when lived with courage and generosity, could shift the course of countless others. Yet those who knew her intimately often shook their heads at such portrayals. She never wanted fame, Darnell would remind them. She wanted soil in her hands, and mouths fed, and hearts awakened. The rest is just story. The years moved on as they do. Children grew up, started their own gardens, taught their own families. Volunteers who had once been strangers became mentors, then elders, guiding the next wave of dreamers. The garden remained the central node of this network, a place where the essence of Eleanor's life could be felt in every leaf, every bloom, every root. One autumn evening, decades after the first defiance, a letter arrived at the foundation. It was from a young woman in Kenya, a recipient of one of the international garden projects. She wrote about a community that had once struggled with famine, now thriving, children laughing as they harvested their own vegetables. She signed it simply, "For Eleanor Whitmore, who taught us to grow hope." Darnell held the letter to his chest, tears streaming down his face. He had never met this young woman, yet he felt the same warmth that had once radiated from Eleanor herself. It was the continuity of kindness, alive and unbroken. That night, under a sky washed with stars, Darnell walked through the garden alone. The lanterns glowed softly, the wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere, faint and comforting, the sound of a rocking chair creaking in rhythm with the earth seemed to follow him. He paused, running his fingers over the soil, and whispered, "We did what you asked. We kept it alive." The garden responded in its own way, the rustle of leaves, the sway of stalks, the quiet hum of life unending. By the following spring, the garden had grown even larger, expanding into unused plots, abandoned fields, and rooftops. Workshops were held for teaching sustainable farming, nutrition, and community engagement. Children learned not only to grow food but to care for one another, embodying Eleanor's lesson that nurturing life is inseparable from nurturing humanity. People from distant cities came to Willow Creek to volunteer, learn, and witness a story that had begun with one woman, one patch of land, and one unwavering commitment to compassion. And in every corner of the Foundation's global network, the same principle endured. Kindness is contagious. Courage is visible. One small act, when grounded in integrity and nurtured by community, can ripple through the world, transforming despair into opportunity. Eleanor Whitmore's garden was no longer merely a piece of land. It was a symbol, a testament, a living reminder that hope is strongest when rooted in the soil of shared humanity. On a calm evening, decades into the future, an elderly volunteer bent to plant a seed in Eleanor's original garden plot. She paused, feeling the earth's cool embrace against her hands, and whispered softly, "Grow well, Eleanor. We won't forget." The wind carried her words across the fields, through the greenhouses, over mountains and rivers, touching gardens in distant lands. Somewhere, in that movement of leaves and earth and hearts, Eleanor's spirit smiled. The garden had outlived one lifetime, but it had not outlived its mission. And as long as someone planted a seed with care, her legacy would continue, eternal, steadfast, and alive.